Today is one of the last sermons, and it's in Matthew 26, toward the end of Matthew's gospel. And the question is this: are you still sleeping? Are you still asleep? Are you still asleep? So I want to talk about something real for just a minute. How many times have you caught yourself doom scrolling, like TikTok or Facebook or something like that, or just binge watching a show on TV, or just taking an unexpected nap, only to realize that you've been sleeping on something important in your life? Maybe it was a job around the house you were meant to do and you forgot, or time with your kids. This is something I'm realizing. I'll end up scrolling on my phone for 5 minutes and I miss time with my kids because I'm just distracted. Maybe it's something simple like that. Maybe it's an assignment that was due and you just weren't paying attention and you forgot about it. Maybe it's a text you forgot to send, a phone call you should have made, some opportunity that has come and gone, and you missed it. You were sleeping on it. I think we've all been there. Maybe you remember a time in class when you were so tired you could barely keep your eyes open. Maybe it was after a long night of studying, or more likely, a long night of doing anything but studying. But whatever you were doing, it kept you up all night. And so you think, I'll just close my eyes for a second, and the next thing you know, you're out. You're knocked out cold. The teacher's voice fades. When you wake up, class is almost over, and you've missed everything important that happened in between. Maybe even some information that really could have helped you with that exam or quiz or whatever. Again, I think we've all been there. We know what that feeling is like. Falling asleep in class isn't just about missing some notes. It's not just about the disrespect to a teacher. It's about missing opportunity, an opportunity to grow, to learn, to develop. That moment is a chance to get something that could make a difference in your life, and you slept on that moment. You missed it. Now, in that sense, metaphorically, we do it all the time. We sleep on God. We sleep on opportunities in life. We miss stuff. We miss stuff because we're too tired or distracted. Now, you might have missed like an hour of school when you fell asleep, but the story today with the disciples and Jesus is, of course, something far greater. They fall asleep and they miss out on something literally cosmic in scope, something we couldn't even imagine, like really big. And so I want to look at the story. Actually, I forgot. I had some other scriptures first, because this isn't the only time that people fall asleep in the Bible, and it's not the only time that God says something about it. And so I wanted to give us context from the Old Testament, particularly the prophet Isaiah, the one who talks about her, the son of David, the root of Jesse, the one who talks about the suffering servant, the anointed one who will come and do the good work of God. Isaiah prophesies much about Jesus, and so it would make sense that we could look to Isaiah and get some context clues for what Jesus will say in Matthew 26. So a couple of examples. Isaiah 51:17. Wake yourself, stand up, Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, who have drunk to the dregs the bowl, the cup of staggering. Well, you're going to see in Matthew 26, Jesus is going to talk to God about the cup. Take this cup from me. And then he's going to tell his friends, wake up, wake up. Couldn't you stay awake? It's a not very accidental connection there, a not so subtle connection. This is really obvious that Jesus is connecting the dots of what he's experiencing to what Isaiah prophesied in those later chapters, the 50s and 60s. So in Isaiah 52, we see, awake, awake. Put on your strength, O Zion. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, for there shall no more come into you the uncircumcised and the unclean. So he says, put on the beautiful stuff. So the first one is saying, wake up because you've already experienced the wrath of God. Now it's time for something new. Then a little bit later in chapter 52, it's wake up and put on what is beautiful because nothing else unclean is going to come in. And then finally in Isaiah 60, arise and shine, for your light has come. Wake up and shine. The light has come. The glory of the Lord has risen upon you. So the prophet Isaiah, when he speaks of waking up, contrary to what our mind might assume, it's good. It's a good thing. This isn't the angry parent beating the kid saying, get out of bed, we're going to be late. It's more like the excited parent saying, wake up, wake up. The only example I can think of right now is Santa came. Like, let's come downstairs and see what's under the tree, right? Or what's in your stocking. Whatever. That's just the first thing that popped into my head. It's like a happy excitement thing. Like, wake up. I know it was bad before, but something good has happened now. It's waking up to something better, not worse. And I think that's an important context for the things that Jesus says. Why does he say them? Because he recognizes that what he is doing is bringing about something new and better for his friends. But they're asleep, or at least they're falling asleep. They're at risk of sleeping, and they're going to sleep right through it. They're not going to see the beautiful and good thing that God is doing. So in Mark 13, Jesus tells his disciples, be awake, be alert, because you don't know when the Lord of the house is coming, whether in the evening or at midnight or at the cock crow or in the morning. Basically, be vigilant, stay up. You don't know what's happening. The great task of religion is to keep us fully awake, alert, conscious. Then we will know whatever it is we need to know. When we're present, we will know the presence of God. That's what it means to be awake. It is that simple, but it's also that hard. Too much religion has encouraged us to be unconscious. Think about that for a second. Much of religion that we've experienced has taught us to be unconscious, when in fact the main goal of our faith is to wake us up, to make us alert and aware. It's an interesting thought. God respects us too much for that. In the past, I think Christians have done a lot of fear-mongering, and even these warnings to wake up and not fall asleep have become more scare tactics. You better wake up. You don't know what's coming next. But again, that's not the vibe that Jesus is giving off here. It's more of an anticipation, a hope. You're sleeping through the beautiful thing God is about to do. You're going to miss it. It's the light of a new day. It's the dawn of a new beginning. As Revelation, another book that's often used to scare Christians instead of encouraging them as it was intended, Revelation ends with God promising, behold, I'm making all things new. There will be no sun because God will be the light of our days. And there will never be night in the new heavens and new earth, in the new Jerusalem. It's a hope. It's good news. And too often we forget Jesus is good news. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the last words Jesus speaks to his apostles, the ones we're going to read this morning, are stay awake. He says it twice, stay awake with me. Let's look at the text, Matthew 26, beginning in verse 36. Everybody there? Matthew 26, verse 36. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, if you don't know who that is, that's James and John, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. He said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and he prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep, take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. My betrayer is at hand. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In Matthew 26, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's the olive grove, just at the foot of a mountain in East Jerusalem. And he's here preparing to face the most intense moment of his earthly life. We know in the Gospels it says he sweats like drops of blood. He's preparing to go to the cross, to be executed unjustly. He's preparing to demonstrate the depth of his love and snuff out the fires of human hatred and anger and evil. He's preparing to die so that his friends can live. And he says to those friends, just stay awake with me for an hour while I pray. But what happens? They fall asleep. Not once, not twice, 3 times. not unlike Peter, who will go on to deny Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. This time before the morning, in the garden, his friends will fall asleep 3 times. It's like if you don't know, anything in threes in the ancient world was their version of superlative, good, better, best. So when you say they fell asleep the 3rd time, it's like saying they are the sleepiest, the least committed, the most untrustworthy. It's a heavy-handed thing. They failed to do what Jesus asked. During his most crucial hour, his friends can't stay up with him. They don't understand. They're oblivious to the cosmic shift that's about to take place. The word watch in the text, greguro, from Greek, is a word that means to keep watch or stay alert or stay awake. It's all really the same thing. Stay awake. Pay special attention so you can avoid or prevent some catastrophic tragedy. That's what the word means. So the command to keep watch with me has a quality of urgency, but also solidarity. It's often used as a military term. You stay awake together as a group facing danger. The command has this idea of bearing witness, that we watch over someone who's in danger, someone who's facing some ordeal. We stay present. We watch what happens, even if we're not able to stop it from happening, even if we have no power over it. It's that sense of solidarity. It's to be with the person who's preparing for danger, for struggle. Is anybody here heard of Primo Levi, Italian chemist? Maybe not. He wrote a couple of books, but he's deceased now. He died probably 20 years ago. But he was in Auschwitz. He was an Italian chemist. He was taken in by force to the death camps. And in Auschwitz, he was tasked as a chemist with helping produce basically nitrile, rubber products. I don't really remember the details, but they were running out of tires. The Nazis were running out of tires on their vehicles and stuff. And he was one of the chemists who had to help them make rubber in the death camps. He wrote about some of that in his books. It came up often, but in one of his books, The Periodic Table, he talks about basically what it was like in Auschwitz. And he claims that the need to show solidarity and stand together, the need to stay alert and ready to help one another, is the only thing that keeps people human in a dehumanizing death camp. Basically, he says, it was the sense that we all stayed together and looked out for each other. That was the only thing keeping us human in a place that tried to strip away our humanity. It's an amazing thought. Even when utterly exhausted, for prisoners in Auschwitz to leave each other, to suffer or die alone, would have been inexcusable. I think that's some of what we see in Gethsemane, if we're really looking. The disciples falling asleep, it's simultaneously an act of abandonment, of disloyalty, of betrayal. The theme of betrayal is constant in these chapters of Matthew. It's constant in all 4 Gospels at the crucifixion. Jesus has been abandoned. The betrayal of falling asleep in that case is much greater than the betrayal of falling asleep in class at school or here at church. Wake up! Just kidding. Hopefully you're not asleep yet. I'm only halfway through, so I got a lot more. You get the idea. It's not as serious if you fall asleep right now as if you fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane, but it's the principle, right? It's the sense that you're not committed, that there's something more important in that moment, whether it's distraction or being tired and needing rest or whatever it is. And so Jesus, he eventually finds them asleep again, and he wakes them up and says, just sleep later. My betrayer's here. It's time to move on. It's just like his sad, it's kind, I think it's nice, but it's like a sad resignation of humanity. Like, okay, just go ahead and sleep. I know you're not going to be able to do it. Almost like the parent who just gives up. You just give up at some point. It's like, I don't care anymore. Just do it. It's that, some of you know what that feels like. It's this mental exhaustion. I can't carry the team on my back anymore. Just do it. I don't care. I don't care. That's how I feel Jesus in this story, that he goes to his friends in this moment where he really needed them, and they've fallen again, and he says, it's fine. I don't care. It's sad. Humanity cannot bear too much reality. We can't really be awake the way we want to. It's too much for us. I think that's part of what this story reminds me. Jesus, though, he remains awake, even to the deadly consequences of our sleep. Just like falling asleep in class, the disciples missed out on a moment, something that might have shaped them in ways they couldn't imagine. They missed out on an opportunity to stand with Jesus, to learn from him, to pray with him, to pray for him, to grow in their faith. They missed out on being part of something extraordinary because they couldn't stay awake, because they didn't keep each other awake. Later, they would all fall away and be scattered in fear because they couldn't stay awake. Matthew 26 makes clear God is in control of all these events, however tragic they may seem. Jesus is the Son of God who suffers and dies. His death is voluntary. He's praying as an act of obedience to do what God will for him to do, and his sacrifice is offered in perfect love. But it doesn't mean the scene isn't frustrating. Though all of that is true, it's still a heart-wrenching moment. Just like the disciples, we, I think, can be in the middle of something big, something God is trying to teach us, something God is trying to show us or invite us to participate in, and we miss it because we're sleeping on God. We're spiritually, emotionally, or physically out of touch or distracted or tuned out. Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to stay awake and pray, and they could not keep their eyes open. They didn't understand the gravity of the moment. And so that made me think about other people in the Bible who, as kids today would say, slept on God, right? They missed it. Isn't that the way people talk now? You just like sleep on something, just miss it. Is that true? Ethan, help me. You're 20-something, right? Is that something young people say? Okay. Don't let me sound dumb on YouTube. Okay. All right, so I found a couple of biblical examples where people slept on God, right? They missed out, literally. The first one's Jonah. Everybody remember Jonah? He's called to go to the Ninevites. He's supposed to preach repentance. And then, of course, they will repent, and God will forgive them and restore them. But Jonah doesn't like that because the Ninevites are not nice people, and he thinks they should be punished. And he gets frustrated. He says, God, I know you have too much kindness. You're too nice. You're too patient. And I know as soon as they say, oh, we're sorry, you're going to say, okay, I forgive you. And I don't want that. They deserve to suffer. And so Jonah resists God's call, and he gets on a boat and goes the opposite direction. And it's a fascinating story. But he tries to avoid God's call. He slept on his mission, on his calling. And it took a storm, being swallowed up by a great fish, to wake him up. Had Jonah continued to resist God's call, I think Nineveh would have missed out on that opportunity for repentance. So God had to wake him up, literally and figuratively, in that story. I thought of another one, Samson and Delilah. Another famous story. Samson, the judge over Israel, had great strength, but it came through a Nazirite vow that he didn't cut his hair. We say no bick, no booze, no bodies. So you can't use a razor or cut your hair. You can't drink alcoholic fermented beverages, and you can't touch dead bodies. That's the Nazaritic vow, the Nazirite vow. And he took that vow from childhood. His parents, I think, forced it on him, but he continued that vow, and it gave him great strength. And so Delilah, whom Samson loved, was bribed by the Philistines to discover the secret of his strength. And he finally told her that it was in his hair, in his Nazirite vow. And so when he literally fell asleep, she had someone cut his hair and took all of his power. Now, of course, his story ends a little more potently. He gets his hair back and his power back, and he kills more Philistines in his death than he ever did in his life, but he still dies. And it's still kind of a sad story. He neglected his commitment to God. He literally and figuratively was sleeping on God. He was missing the opportunity. So I thought about that. In our lives, I think it's easy to get caught up in routines, easy to be distracted, easy to end up in our own little worlds and miss what God is doing all around us. And so God calls us to wake up, to be aware, to be alert, to be vigilant, to care more. The disciples missed that opportunity to be present with Jesus in his moment of need. And I don't want us to make that same mistake. I don't want us to miss our Gethsemane moments in life. And this is where it's going to get a little more personal. Just as Jesus asked his disciples to stay awake and pray with him, he asks me to stay awake with him, to be alert to what he's doing in the world, to be with him through the difficulty and the suffering so that we can also be there when the good things come, when transformation takes place. He says in Isaiah 43, I am doing a new thing. It springs up right now. Do you not perceive it? God is doing new things. And he says, can't you tell that something is happening? Can you not sense that God is on the move? Why would you not participate in that? Are you awake? Are you paying attention to what God is doing? So I have a few questions, which will be sort of the points of my sermon. The first one is this: why do we need to stay awake? Why do we need to stay awake? Well, I think it's because God's plan is both cosmic and personal. God is doing something. We've said that already, but it needs to be repeated. God is doing something, and he's doing something at cosmic and individual levels. In Romans 8, Paul talks about how all of creation is groaning in the pangs of child labor, ready to give birth to this big and beautiful new world, this wonderful thing that God is recreating. And he says the world itself, the universe, cosmos, is sort of waiting with bated breath to see the revelation of the children of God, to see you be who you were made to be, for you to wake up. The whole universe is waiting for you to wake up. Think about that. That's what Romans 8 says, to wake up to what God is doing in your life and in the world around you. That's incredible. That's you. That's me, the children of God. The universe on the edge of its seat, waiting for you to live into your potential as a child of God. And so that cosmic vision becomes personal. Colossians 1, Jesus says, rather the Apostle Paul says that Jesus, through God's power, is reconciling the whole universe and everything within it. Every individual person being reconciled back to God, their Father in heaven. Your family, your friends, the people you don't like, all of them. God is working to restore and bring back and repair and ultimately reconcile to God's self. That's God's plan, and he invites you to be a part of his reparations, his fixing what's been broken. But we can't be part of that when we're asleep behind the wheel. And I think that was the disciples' problem in Gethsemane. God was inviting them to see what was unfolding, and they were missing it. Romans 13, and this will be on the screen, verses 11 and 12. Besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. Why? Because salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. That sounds like good news. Paul says, wake up to the church in Rome. Wake up. I know it's dark. I know it's tiring. I know it's frustrating. I know your eyes feel heavy, but the day is almost here. God is prepared to finish what he started. God calls us to be awake and alert, fully aware of his presence and his purpose in our lives. Romans 13 reminds us that the time to wake up is now. Now. It's always now. Our salvation is nearer than ever. God is at work in the world. Whether through busyness or boredom or other distractions, we tend to miss out on the opportunity to join in God's work. And I think that's a shame. Like the disciples of old, we don't realize the significance of the night that we're in and how important that next morning is going to be. And so we miss out. I don't want to look back on my life and think that I missed what God was doing because I was too tired or distracted. It says in Matthew 26, Jesus took them over to the side and said, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he was sorrowful and troubled. Jesus asking his friends to keep watch with him is also a reminder of why we need to be awake. Because we have work to do. We have people to love. We don't think of it this way, but Jesus needed support. We just think of how tough he was, that he sweat like drops of blood and he did all this for us. He loves us so much. And that's all true, but it looked like he needed friends. He was begging for help, crying out for support, and his friends dropped the ball. If even Jesus needed the support of his friends, needed his friends to stay awake with him, how much more do we need our friends to stay awake with us? How much more do we need to be friends who stay awake? It's the importance of community, of mutual support, especially in times of distress, when things are hard. In his moment of anguish, Jesus wanted companionship. He wanted friends. We're not meant to face the challenges of life on our own. God designed us to be part of a community where we support and encourage one another, where we share our burdens, where we grow together in faith. We have to be intentional to create that. That doesn't just happen on its own. You have to invest in relationships. You have to be vulnerable. You have to open yourself up. And it's a challenge sometimes to go beyond surface level interactions, even in the church. So I challenge you to do it. Wake up for one another. Quit sleeping on these people. Intercession. It's something the church has taught for 2,000 years. Something that is carried over from ancient Judaism, to intercede for another. That's what part of being a Christian is. It's intercession. It's caring about others, their needs, their struggles. We have to pray for one another. We have to be supportive friends. We have to learn and seek the gift of encouragement. We have to be attentive. We have to be responsive to the needs of people around us. We have to offer help, sometimes even when it's not been asked for. I don't mean unsolicited advice. I just mean help, genuine help, humble help. That's why we need to stay awake, for all those reasons. So then the next question is, why don't we? Why do we fall asleep? Why do we fall asleep? In our spiritual journey, I think falling asleep represents being spiritually dull or complacent or indifferent. I think that's often where it comes from. Just like physical sleep prevents us from being active and engaged in daily life, spiritual sleep hinders us from seeing and participating in the amazing things that God does all around us. I think we find ourselves drifting into sleep, and I tried to think this week, what makes people sleepy? Well, just being tired, right? That's the obvious one. Being tired. I think also being bored. Sometimes you end up napping because you're bored. You just kind of drift off. I think sometimes we nap because we're overindulging, like at Thanksgiving. That's one of the only days a year that I could take a nap because I've eaten so much food that I'm in a carb coma, and it's like I'm just ready to conk out in a recliner. And then the last one, maybe like drunkenness or substances that would make us tired. I don't know. So I try to think, what are some real life examples of things that make us sleepy? And then I realized each of those is metaphorical for spiritual struggles. Some of it's just being tired. That's not an intentional sin against God. You're just tired. And we have reason to be tired. The world is exhausting. It's broken and it's falling apart, and we're trying to hold pieces together all the time. It's tiring work. And I think Jesus has grace for that. He knows that we're tired. He knows that some of you, day to day to day, are just barely getting by, making things hold together the best you can. And it's okay to be tired. And sometimes it's more intentional. Sometimes we're bored because we're not actively doing good. And in our boredom, we kind of waste away. We get distracted. We spiritually doom scroll and get lost, or we actually sleep. And then, of course, the overindulgence. I thought of the prophets when they used to say, you fattened yourselves up for a day of slaughter, which is a way of saying you care so much about yourself that you forget about everybody else. That is spiritual sleep. That's spiritual sleepwalking. The Pharisees did it all the time. They looked to be very spiritual, and Jesus said, but on the inside, they're dead. They're asleep. They haven't been woken up. And then that last one, drunkenness, I think it's the filling it in with other things. That we try to substitute for God all these other things in life, and they numb us to the reality of God in our lives. They distract us and they change us from the inside. These things, what we might think of as idolatry and idols, the things we invest ourselves in over and over again, and they become addictive, and eventually they make us sleepy. And they take our willpower away, and they transform us into people with less and less control, so that we might just doze off without realizing it. Again, these are all literal things I'm kind of forcing into spiritual metaphors, but I think it's helpful. And I think that's why Jesus uses analogies like sleep, because he knows we can relate to that and we can understand, why do we get sleepy? So while these might not all be intentional sins, each of these things keeps us in some way from something greater, sometimes something far greater. We fail to participate in what God is doing because of all these other things. So then how do we stay awake? I think that's the next question. If we know we should be awake and we know why we keep falling asleep, then how do we stop falling asleep? How do we wake up and stay awake? Jesus said, watch and pray so that you don't fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. What's the temptation? The temptation is to sleep. And he's saying the spirit wants to be awake. The God in you, the image of God born in you, knows that God is doing something and you want to participate in it. But there's something in you, this broken thing about you, this flesh that is resistant, that just wants to nap and miss it and not have to be a part of it. There's this fundamental truth that Jesus exposes in human nature. While our intentions and desires might be aligned with the will of God, our human weaknesses hinder our follow-through. And I'll say that again. I think that's helpful. Even when our intentions are aligned with the will of God, when we want to do what is right, there is often something physically, spiritually, emotionally, whatever in us that's bankrupted, that's broken, that's unable to follow through, even when our intentions are good. What do you do with that? How do you stay awake when your literal eyes can't stay open? And I think the only answer would be God's help. There's an aspect of the gospel that is truly dependent, that there is something about us that is missing that we can't fill in ourselves. We need God. So the first answer to how do we stay awake is with God's help. We need God to keep us awake. I think the disciples wanted to stay awake, but they didn't ask Jesus how. They didn't seem to try very hard. I think they assumed because they wanted to be good friends to Jesus that they would be. But just wanting to be a good spouse or a good friend or a good parent doesn't make you one. Intentions don't equal success. Sometimes we need help. We need God. We need to cultivate spiritual habits. So I want you to pay attention because this is getting practical now. These are things you could do when you go home this week to stay awake. Practice spiritual habits. Pray and fast and continue in corporate worship like what you're doing right now. And go to Bible studies and join small groups. And we're going to try to start more small groups over the next year. Get involved in smaller communities of faith, places where you can talk more and interact more and ask questions and confess sin and support one another. Be connected spiritually to other people and do the spiritual habits that create health, like fasting and prayer and Bible study. Do the common sense things that Christians have done for 2 millennia to help yourself stay awake. It's really not that hard. You just have to choose to do it. To assume that you will just automatically do it is foolish. You will have to make choices, defining choices about your life spiritually to make sure you are awake, that you stay awake. We have to recognize our personal weaknesses. We have to be honest about where we fail. And that awareness, I think, is the first step in seeking God's strength. Vigilance means being alert and aware of the spiritual dynamics that are at play in our lives. You can't be in tune with any of that if you're not spiritually active, if you're not fasting, praying, reading scripture, involved in corporate worship. If you're not doing any of these age-old tested things to build spiritual health, then you're not going to be spiritually healthy. So that's the first thing. Secondly, remain accountable. Sometimes God's strength is found in other people. In fact, more and more, I have realized that my strength from God comes through others. I don't get a magic connection to God where he sends lightning power through the clouds into me spiritually. I think as a kid, maybe I thought that's what would happen, is that God would somehow just magically give me power. But what really happens is God empowers me through other people in very obvious and practical ways, and sometimes very subtle and not so obvious ways. But he uses people. So often in my life, he uses other people. But how can he use people if you're not connected to those people? The disciples should have helped each other. They should have been accountable to one another. You can't do this alone. So I want you to think for a second. If you feel like maybe you doze off every now and then spiritually, you're not alert, you're not vigilant as you ought to be. Maybe it's because you don't have accountability. Maybe it's because you don't have people helping you along, people to support you, people to check in on you. If not, find somebody. I didn't do it often, but I remember one time I overslept in college and missed one of my 7 a.m. classes. And it was an important day. I think it was a Greek lab, and we had to take a bunch of notes. And anyway, all I remember is that I immediately knew what to do. I texted my friend, who always took careful notes, and sure enough, he was there that day. He took notes, and he very happily lended me his notebook, and I was able to copy the stuff over that I needed. It was simple. Yes, I overslept. Yes, I missed class, but because I had a friend who cared, I didn't really miss out on as much. He got me caught back up, and thankfully I ended up passing Greek. So it worked out fine. But I needed help. Sometimes we fail to ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You will not stay awake on your own. When I drive long road trips at night, I ask Kylie sometimes not to sleep. She'll be like, "You care if I go to sleep?" And sometimes I'll say, "It's fine if I'm wired, I've had enough coffee." But other times when I feel myself kind of, and I don't want to pull over at a rest stop, I'll ask her to ask me trivia questions, to talk to me about anything at all, to turn on music we can sing along to and turn the volume up a little bit. Anything she could do to help me stay awake, because sometimes you just need help staying awake. If I didn't ask for that help, we might be in a wreck on the side of the road somewhere because I was too afraid to ask someone to help me stay awake and too stubborn to pull over. Don't do that with your spiritual life. Now, I want to end with, the happier side. What if we don't stay awake? What if all this happens and then we still fall asleep like the disciples? Jesus says, "Rise, let's go. Here comes my betrayer. Here comes my betrayer. Let's go." I don't think Jesus said it like that. "Come on, guys, let's go. Here's my betrayer." I think it was darker than that. But he does say, "Come on, let's go." He doesn't say, "Here's my betrayer. Let's run and hide." Jesus embraces not only Judas the betrayer with the kiss and the 30 pieces of silver, he embraces the friends who failed to stay awake with him. He later embraces all the disciples, even those who flew in fear, those who scattered when he was taken into custody. All of them. The good ones, the mediocre ones, the bad ones, it doesn't matter. The success, the failure, it doesn't matter to Jesus. He just loves them. Jesus loves you. I hope you understand that. We can talk a lot about waking up and staying awake, and I do think this is important, but I don't want you to leave and think, if I fall asleep, what's going to happen? Because if you fall asleep, I can tell you what will happen. Jesus will say, "Wake up," for the third time, and then he'll tell you, "Get your rest later. There are things I need to do right now." What he won't do is abandon you. What he won't do is guilt trip you. He will keep you accountable, and he will do what you are unable to finish. He'll finish it. It's what he said. Jesus says, "Wake up." Even when we just want to drift off and pretend it's not real, he says, "Wake up and be a part of the solution. Be part of the new day." As spiritually vigilant disciples, we choose to take Jesus' path of courage and trust. We know that the night is darkest just before the dawn. We rely on God's power to stay awake to the needs of those around us. We maintain hope that God will work all things together for good. We rely on one another for support, for accountability. We know that a new morning full of new mercies awaits us. And so we stay awake. So I thought a lot about the aspect of Jesus' Garden of Gethsemane experience that we don't have recorded. We don't have God's answers. We don't have the sense that Jesus felt at the end of his time of prayer. And I've had to think about that many times in the Easter season, the Passion narrative. What did Jesus feel at the end of Gethsemane? How could he come out of Gethsemane and say, "Come on, let's go, my betrayer is here," and be so ready to just embrace his arrest and his crucifixion, the shaming, the mocking, the suffering? How could he go so readily to the cross while his friends fled in fear? What was the difference? What did Jesus get in the Garden of Gethsemane that his friends did not receive? I wonder if you've ever thought about that before. Hebrews chapter 12 gives us the answer. Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Who for the joy that was set before him. Joy. It was joy. Joy is the gift that God offers those who stay awake. God supplied Jesus with joy for his journey, even through crucifixion and beyond the grave. Joy was the power behind Jesus' faithfulness. His joy equals our salvation. Think about that. Where did his joy come from? It came from being awake. His joy came from God. the joy of new life, new beginnings, new opportunities, the joy of a new day that comes after the darkness of the night. So don't sleep on God. Don't be like the disciples who missed out on this critical moment because they couldn't stay awake. God is doing something big. God is radically redeeming the entire cosmos. That seems too big to even talk about in a room in Gallipolis, Ohio, but it's true. The entire universe is being reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. That's happening. And God has invited you to be a part of it. Those disciples eventually woke up. They did take their rest later. And then after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to them again, and this time they were ready, and they woke up and they stayed awake, and they went out and did miraculous, wonderful things in the name of Jesus. Their work still reverberates in the world today. We still name them and honor them and read their letters and talk about what their churches are doing all over the world 2,000 years later because they woke up, because they walked in the light of Christ, and then they were shining that light into other people's lives. They participated in the good news of Jesus. They helped people. They taught people. They encouraged people. They forgave their enemies. They loved their neighbors. They produced the fruits of the Spirit. They became people of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Ultimately, they helped play a part in God's saving work. And now it's your turn. It's your turn to join Jesus in loving and healing and saving. It's your chance to help God make all things new. The question is, are you still asleep? Are you still sleeping?